I never told you I would meet you here.
Danielle? I'm sorry. Get out! You don't have to leave, do you?
Yes, I do.
The room went silent the moment Derek walked in with another woman on his arm. Danielle stood beside her own birthday table in a red dress she hadn't worn in years, candles glowing, her family and friends waiting. She smiled when she saw him coming, thinking this was her surprise. Then she saw the woman beside him, 27 years old, her fingers wrapped around his arm, like she'd always belonged there. Derek didn't hug her. He didn't wish her happy birthday. He looked at her the way a man looks at a contract he's already decided to walk away from. "Danielle, don't make a scene, I'm leaving you." She laughed, waiting for the punchline that never came. "I'm choosing her." Her smile collapsed. She looked around at everyone watching, then back at him, and all she could manage was, "But it's my birthday." Derek shrugged. "I'm 47. I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending I'm still attracted to a 45-year-old woman." She whispered it again, "But it's my birthday," as if saying it twice might undo what was happening. "Exactly," he said. "I wanted to tell you before you got too old to understand." He walked out with Chloe on his arm, leaving his wife of 23 years standing beside an untouched cake in front of everyone who loved her. Nobody in that restaurant noticed the black car parked across the street, or the man inside it who saw the entire thing happen. A man who ran half of Seoul's underworld without ever raising his voice. A man who was about to notice something in Danielle that her own husband had stopped seeing years ago. But that comes later. Welcome to Stories from Seoul. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because you don't want to miss where this goes. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you've been here before, smash that like button. You know what we do. Because what happened to Danielle that night was only the beginning. What Derek didn't know was that his cruelty was about to hand his wife to the one man in Seoul who could destroy him without lifting a finger. But to understand how she got there, we have to go back a few months, to the version of her that still believed silence was the price of love. Several months earlier, Danielle's life looked nothing like the wreckage that would unfold on that restaurant floor. From the outside, her marriage looked steady, even enviable. She was the woman who remembered everyone's birthdays, who kept the household running without ever being asked twice, who had quietly folded her own ambitions into the shape of her husband's career until there was barely anything left of the woman she used to be. She cooked Derek's meals the way he liked them. She managed his calendar, his clients, his moods. When his business nearly collapsed 8 years earlier, she was the one who worked behind the scenes, calling in favors, smoothing over disputes, keeping him from losing everything he'd built. She never asked for credit. She never asked for much of anything. There had been a moment, years back, when Danielle considered opening her own consulting firm. She had the experience. She had the contacts. She stayed up late one night building a proposal, excited in a way she hadn't felt in years, and when she showed it to Derek, he barely looked up from his plate. "A successful husband needs a peaceful wife," he told her, and that was the end of it. She told herself he was right. She told herself peace was worth more than ambition, so she folded the proposal into a drawer and never opened it again. It happened in small doses after that, the way most erosion does. When she bought a new dress for a dinner party, he asked who she was trying to impress. When she wore a little more makeup than usual, he told her she was trying too hard. When she mentioned, once, offhandedly, that she might like to travel somewhere just the two of them, he reminded her that they weren't 25 anymore, and maybe she should act like it. Each comment was small enough to swallow on its own. Together, over 20 years, they had rewritten who she believed herself to be. She stopped buying new clothes. She stopped going out with friends unless Derek approved of the plan first. She stopped looking in mirrors for longer than it took to check her appearance was acceptable, because somewhere along the way she had convinced herself that looking too long would only remind her of what she'd lost. And still, through all of it, Danielle believed Derek loved her. That was the part that would break the audience's heart later, watching her defend a man who had spent 2 decades quietly convincing her she was lucky to be tolerated. She wasn't foolish. She was conditioned. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one from the outside. There had been good years too, or what she'd told herself were good years, early on, before the small cruelties calcified into something permanent. She remembered a trip to the coast in their 5th year of marriage, Derek laughing at something she'd said, pulling her close on the beach as the sun went down, and for a long time afterward she held on to that memory like proof that the man underneath the coldness still existed somewhere, that if she was patient enough, understanding enough, she might coax him back out. She didn't yet understand that people don't hide their true selves behind cruelty. Cruelty is usually the truest self, worn down over time until it stops bothering to hide. Her friends noticed the changes long before she did. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, the way conversations about Derek's latest remark would trail off into uncomfortable silence at dinner parties. Danielle brushed it off every time. She told herself her friends didn't understand her marriage, didn't see the private moments of tenderness that balanced out the criticism, didn't know Derek the way she did. She defended him reflexively, automatically, the way a person defends anything they've invested too much of themselves into to admit might be failing. On the morning of her 45th birthday, Danielle woke up early, unable to fall back asleep, her mind already running through what the day might hold. She lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, allowing herself the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe he'd remembered. She got up and waited. No flowers on the kitchen counter. No breakfast waiting for her. No message on her phone. She told herself it didn't mean anything, that Derek was probably planning something for later, something bigger than flowers and breakfast, and she busied herself getting ready for the day so she wouldn't have to sit with the silence too long. In the back of her closet, behind years of clothes she never wore anymore, she found a red dress, the one she'd worn the night she met Derek, back when she was 22, and certain that her whole life was about to begin. She hadn't tried it on in years. She wasn't even sure it would fit. It did. She stood in front of the mirror longer than she had, in longer than she could remember, turning slightly, studying the woman looking back at her. For the first time in years, she smiled at her own reflection, not because someone had told her to, but because something in her chest had loosened just slightly. Maybe he'll remember, she whispered to no one. Derek walked past her in the hallway on his way out the door. He didn't stop. He didn't look at the dress, didn't notice she'd curled her hair, didn't say a single word about the fact that his wife looked like she was trying, for the first time in years, to feel beautiful again. "We're going out tonight," was all he said, already halfway out the door. Danielle's heart lifted anyway. She told herself this was it. This was the surprise she'd been waiting for, that he'd planned something after all, and had simply been too busy to show it. She spent the rest of the day in a kind of nervous, hopeful excitement she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, choosing her jewelry carefully, practicing what she might say when her friends surprised her, imagining Derek's face when he saw her in the red dress. She had no idea what was coming. And that's what made it so much worse. By the time she arrived at the restaurant that evening, her friends and family already seated at a table decorated with candles and flowers, Danielle felt something close to happiness for the first time in longer than she could admit. She hugged her sister. She laughed at a joke someone made. She glanced toward the door every few minutes, waiting for Derek to walk in, already imagining the moment he'd see her in that red dress, and remember, finally, who she used to be to him. When the door opened and he walked in, Danielle's breath caught, just for a second, before she registered the woman on his arm. And that's where we left her, standing beside her own birthday table, watching her husband of 23 years choose someone else in front of everyone she loved. Now, back in the restaurant, after Derek had delivered his final cruelty and turned to leave, something in Danielle refused to let him walk away that easily. She stood up from the table so fast her chair nearly toppled behind her, and the words that came out of her mouth next would make viewers want to reach through the screen and shake her. "What can I do to make you stay?" Derek actually laughed. Chloe, to her credit, looked uncomfortable, glancing away as though she hadn't expected this part, as though even she understood there was something deeply wrong about watching a woman beg for a man who had just humiliated her in front of everyone she loved. But Danielle wasn't finished. "I'll lose weight," she said, her voice cracking. "I'll change my clothes. I'll stop asking you for attention. I'll give you whatever you want. Just don't do this. Not tonight. Not on my birthday." Derek looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they thought they'd already solved. "That's the problem, Danielle," he said flatly. "I don't want you anymore." The words hung in the air like something physical. Danielle felt her legs give slightly beneath her, and she gripped the edge of the table to keep herself upright. Around her, the restaurant had gone completely silent, except for the soft clink of silverware from tables that had nothing to do with her. Strangers pretending not to watch the worst moment of a woman's life unfold in real time. She looked at her sister, at her closest friends, searching their faces for something, anything, that might tell her this wasn't really happening. What she found instead was pity. And pity, somehow, hurt worse than anything Derek had said. "Derek, please." Danielle tried again, her voice smaller now, stripped of whatever dignity she'd been clinging to. 23 years. We built a life together. And now I'm building a different one, he said, already reaching for Chloe's hand. "Happy birthday, Danielle." He turned and walked toward the door, Chloe's heels clicking against the marble floor beside him, and Danielle didn't chase after him. She couldn't. Her body simply refused to move, as though some part of her understood that chasing him now would only make the humiliation complete. She sank back into her chair beside the cake, with her name written in careful cursive icing, a cake nobody would eat that night, and she stared at the candles until someone finally reached over and blew them out for her, because she couldn't manage even that small task herself. Her sister tried to comfort her. Friends offered soft words that Danielle barely registered. Eventually, unable to sit under the weight of everyone's careful, pitying glances any longer, she stood up, gathered her purse, and told them she needed air. Nobody stopped her. Nobody knew what to say. Outside, the night was cold enough to sting against her bare arms, and Danielle walked without any real direction, tears finally breaking free now that she was away from the audience of her own destruction. She still had the cake in her hands, carrying it out of some strange, wounded instinct, as though leaving it behind would make the night more real than it already was. She didn't notice the black luxury sedan parked across the street. She didn't notice the man inside watching her through tinted glass, his expression unreadable, his attention fixed entirely on her. Kang Min-jae was 29 years old, and in certain circles of Seoul, his name alone was enough to end conversations. He controlled interests that stretched across the city, some of them visible on paper, most of them not, and the men who worked for him understood one simple truth. Min-jae did not raise his voice, because he had never needed to. He had been in the restaurant that evening for a private meeting in a back room, unrelated entirely to the woman in red currently walking past his car with mascara running down her face. He had seen the whole thing. The husband, the younger woman, the cake nobody touched. What caught his attention wasn't the scene itself. Public humiliation was nothing new to a man who'd witnessed every version of cruelty Seoul had to offer. What caught his attention was smaller than that. Easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention. Her hands were shaking, and she was still carrying the cake. Something about that detail lodged itself in his mind in a way he couldn't immediately explain. He stepped out of the car as she passed, and Danielle startled slightly at the sudden presence of a stranger on the sidewalk. "Why are you carrying a cake for a man who made you cry?" Min-jae asked, his tone carrying no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Danielle, humiliated and raw and in no mood for a stranger's observations, snapped without thinking. "Mind your business." A faint smile crossed his face, there and gone in an instant. "I was planning to." A pause. "Until I saw him throw away something worth keeping." Danielle didn't have the energy to respond to that. She walked past him, cake still balanced awkwardly in her hands, and didn't look back. Min-jae didn't follow her. He simply watched her disappear down the street, filing away something he couldn't quite name yet, and got back into his car. The next morning brought a different kind of devastation. Danielle woke up in the house she'd shared with Derek for over 2 decades, the ache from the night before still sitting heavy in her chest, and found that he had already moved a portion of his things out. When she checked their joint account out of habit, expecting to see the familiar balance that had sat there for years, she found it nearly empty. She called him immediately, her hands trembling as she dialed. "I'm protecting my assets," Derek told her flatly, as though this were a reasonable thing to say to a woman he'd humiliated in front of her entire family less than 24 hours earlier. "You'll be fine, Danielle. You always find a way." The line went dead before she could respond. Panic set in slowly. Then all at once, Danielle had spent over 20 years managing Derek's life, instead of building her own financial independence. And now she understood, in the clearest terms possible, exactly how vulnerable that decision had left her. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to calculate how long she could survive on what remained in her personal savings. Her phone rang that afternoon, an unfamiliar number, and she almost didn't answer it. When she did, a polite voice on the other end explained that a luxury property management company was interested in interviewing her for a senior position, that her name had come highly recommended, and that they'd love to meet with her that week if she was available. Danielle was confused. She hadn't applied anywhere. She hadn't updated a resume in over 15 years. But something about the offer, arriving exactly when she needed it most, felt too specific to ignore, and with nothing left to lose, she agreed. She dressed carefully for the interview, choosing one of the few professional outfits she still owned, and arrived at a sleek office building in one of the city's wealthier districts. She was led into a top-floor office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul, and the man sitting behind the desk looked up as she entered. Danielle froze in the doorway. It was him, the man from outside the restaurant. Her instinct was immediate and sharp. "I'm not interested," she said, already turning to leave. "You haven't heard the offer," Min-jae said, unbothered by her reaction, his voice as calm as it had been the night before. "I don't need charity," Danielle snapped, her pride flaring hot, even in the middle of her own financial collapse. "Good," Min-jae replied, leaning back slightly in his chair. "Because I'm not offering any." He explained, without dramatics, that he'd overheard her the previous week giving remarkably sound advice to one of the restaurant's staff about handling a difficult situation with a supplier, advice sharp enough that he'd remembered it days later. He told her he managed several properties across the city that were underperforming, and that he believed she had exactly the kind of mind those properties needed. Danielle didn't believe him. She refused the offer outright and left his office without a second glance, certain this was some strange, unwanted continuation of the pity she'd endured the night before. She had no idea that walking away from that office would only be the beginning of a much longer story, one that would eventually bring her right back to that same room, and to the man sitting behind that desk. Danielle held out for exactly 4 days before her savings account forced her hand. She sat at her kitchen table on the 4th night, the same table where she'd once planned dinner parties and business trips that never happened, and did the math over and over until the numbers refused to change no matter how many times she rearranged them. She had enough to survive perhaps 2 months if she was careful. After that, she had nothing. She called the number back the next morning before she could talk herself out of it. Min-jae didn't gloat when she walked back into his office. He didn't make her feel small for changing her mind, didn't mention her earlier refusal at all. He simply slid a folder across the desk toward her, outlining the property she'd be managing, a boutique residential building in one of the city's more difficult districts, chronically understaffed, bleeding money for reasons nobody on his team had been able to pin down. "Fix it," he said, "and we'll talk about the next one." Danielle expected condescension. She'd spent 20 years being managed, corrected, quietly diminished by a man who claimed to love her, and she walked into that building on her first day, braced for more of the same from a stranger who technically now controlled her paycheck. It never came. What she found instead, over the following weeks, was a version of respect she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. She reorganized the building's staffing within her first 10 days, cutting waste Derek would have never noticed and nobody else had bothered to look for. She learned every employee's name by the end of the first week, remembered small details about their lives, the kind of details that made people feel like more than a line item on a payroll sheet. When a difficult client threatened to break his lease over a maintenance dispute, Danielle handled the negotiation herself, calm and precise, and kept the account without giving away a single unnecessary concession. Word of what she was doing reached Min Jae faster than Danielle realized. He didn't say much about it directly, but she noticed him stopping by the property more often than seemed strictly necessary, watching her work from a distance, occasionally asking pointed questions that made it clear he'd been paying far closer attention than she'd assumed. He never flirted with her, not in those early weeks. He treated her the way he apparently treated anyone whose work impressed him, with a kind of quiet, unshowy respect that Danielle found almost disorienting after 2 decades of having her competence treated as an inconvenience. One evening, staying late to review the building's revised budget, Danielle looked up to find Min Jae standing in the doorway of her small office, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know what I find strange?" he asked. Danielle set down her pen, unsure where this was heading. "What?" "You speak like a woman who knows exactly what she's doing." He paused, stepping further into the room. "But you live like a woman who thinks she needs permission." The words landed somewhere Danielle wasn't prepared for. She opened her mouth to deflect, to make some small joke and change the subject the way she'd trained herself to do for 23 years, whenever a conversation edged too close to something true. But nothing came out. She simply sat there, absorbing the accuracy of a sentence a near stranger had assembled about her life in under 10 seconds, something her own husband had never once bothered to notice in over 2 decades of marriage. Min Jae didn't push further. He simply nodded once, as though he'd said exactly what he intended to say and nothing more, and left her alone with the observation. It followed her home that night. It followed her into the following week, resurfacing at odd moments, while she was cooking dinner alone in the too-quiet house, while she was lying awake staring at the ceiling. Somewhere underneath the grief of her marriage ending, something else had started to stir, something Danielle didn't yet have a name for. A few days later, Min Jae asked her to join him for dinner to discuss the building's next quarter projections. Danielle arrived expecting spreadsheets and formality. Instead, she found a quiet restaurant, softly lit, nothing like the sterile conference rooms she'd grown used to. "This isn't a business meeting, is it?" she asked, settling into her chair with more suspicion than nerves. "No," Min Jae admitted, without apology. "It's not." Danielle felt something tighten in her chest, an old, familiar instinct to make herself smaller, to deflect attention before it could turn into disappointment. She reached instinctively for her sleeve, tugging it down over her wrist, an old habit she'd carried for years without fully realizing she still did it. Min Jae noticed. Of course he noticed. He seemed to notice everything. "Why do you do that?" he asked. Danielle glanced down at her own hand, caught in the act. "Do what?" "Pull your sleeve down. You've done it 3 times since you sat down." She hesitated, the old shame rising automatically before she could stop it. "Derek used to say my arms were too big," she said finally, the admission smaller and more humiliating out loud than it had ever felt in her own head. "I guess I never stopped hiding them." Min Jae looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he said, simply, "Then your husband was blind." It wasn't dramatic. He didn't say it with any particular flourish, didn't seem to be performing charm the way Derek used to when he wanted something from her. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, like a fact he expected her to already know. Danielle froze, her fork halfway to her plate, unsure what to do with a sentence delivered with that much certainty. She had spent 23 years being told, in 100 small ways, exactly what was wrong with her body, her age, her ambitions. She had never once, in all that time, heard a man describe her flaws as belonging to someone else's failure of vision rather than her own failure to be enough. Thaluving, they stayed at that restaurant far longer than either of them intended, the conversation drifting easily from one subject to another in a way Danielle hadn't experienced with anyone in years. Min Jae asked her questions Derek had never bothered to ask, about the years before her marriage, about the version of herself she'd been at 22 before she'd folded herself into someone else's expectations. She found herself talking more than she had in a decade, surprised by how much of herself was still in there, waiting to be asked about. He told her, in turn, pieces of his own life he rarely shared with anyone, The weight of inheriting an empire he'd never asked for. The isolation that came with being feared by nearly everyone he encountered. Danielle listened without flinching, without the performative sympathy she'd learned to offer Derek over the years, and something about her genuine attention seemed to catch him off guard. Most people either want something from me or they're afraid of me, he admitted at one point, turning his glass slowly on the table. It's rare that someone just listens. I know what that's like, Danielle said quietly, being talked at instead of talked to. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, the silence comfortable in a way. Silence with Derek had never been. When the evening finally ended and Min-jae walked her to her car, he didn't try to kiss her, didn't push the moment towards something it wasn't ready to become. He simply thanked her for the evening and told her, plainly, that he hoped it wouldn't be the last one. Something in her chest loosened, just slightly, the same way it had the morning she'd found the old red dress in the back of her closet. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Danielle felt beautiful, without feeling like she was being pitied for it. She didn't know yet how dangerous that feeling was about to become, or how quickly everything she'd started rebuilding would be tested by the reappearance of the one person capable of tearing it all back down. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after that dinner, on an evening Danielle had almost allowed herself to feel settled. She was locking up the property office when she saw him standing beside his car in the parking lot, hands in his pockets, wearing the expression of a man who believed he still had every right to be there. Derek. She hadn't seen him since the night of her birthday, hadn't heard from him beyond the cold, clinical messages about the accounts he'd already stripped bare. You look good, he said, as though the last several weeks hadn't happened, as though he hadn't stood in front of everyone she loved and told her she was too old to be worth wanting. Danielle's first instinct was anger, sharp and immediate. But underneath it, in a place she hated herself for, something else stirred too. 23 years didn't disappear because a man was cruel one night in a restaurant. There was history in that anger, history that made her stay rooted to the spot instead of walking past him the way she should have. What do you want, Derek? He stepped closer, and his voice softened into something she recognized from the earliest years of their marriage, a version of him she hadn't heard in a long time. I made a mistake, he said. Chloe isn't what I thought she'd be. She's exhausting, Danielle. She wants things I don't even understand. I miss my wife. Danielle felt her resolve waver, and she hated herself for it even as it happened. 23 years of conditioning didn't dissolve overnight just because a stranger had told her she wasn't too old to be beautiful. Some part of her, the part that had spent 2 decades believing love had to be earned through sacrifice, latched onto Derek's words like they were oxygen. You were always my wife, he told her, reaching for her hand. That doesn't just go away because I made a stupid choice. Danielle wanted to believe him. That was the tragedy of it. She wanted more than anything for the last 23 years to have meant something, for the humiliation of that birthday dinner to have been a temporary madness rather than the truth of how little he'd ever valued her. She went back to him. She didn't tell Min-jae right away. When she finally did, standing in his office with her coat still on, unable to meet his eyes, she watched something shift in his expression. Subtle, but unmistakable. He's my husband, she said, as though that single fact erased everything else. As though 23 years of legal paperwork outweighed the way Derek had discarded her in front of everyone she loved. Min-jae didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to convince her she was making a mistake, didn't offer some grand romantic gesture to compete with the life she was choosing to return to. He simply looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and said 2 words. Then go. No begging, no manipulation, no attempt to make her stay through guilt or persuasion. Just quiet, controlled acceptance that left Danielle strangely unsettled, as though she'd expected a fight, and instead found only silence. She told herself that silence meant he hadn't really cared. It would take her much longer to understand that it meant the opposite. Derek's reconciliation came with conditions, though he didn't frame them that way. He needed her to sign some financial documents, he explained, technicalities related to consolidating their accounts now that they were rebuilding their life together. Danielle, still tangled in old habits of trust, didn't question it. She had spent 23 years not questioning him, and old patterns don't unravel simply because a person wants them to. What she didn't know was that Derek had recently learned something about her late mother's estate, an inheritance Danielle herself had barely paid attention to, tied up for years in the kind of legal complexity that made people forget it existed. Derek had not forgotten. He'd discovered its true value weeks earlier, right around the time his sudden nostalgia for his marriage had reappeared. Danielle began preparing to move back into the house they'd shared for over 2 decades, packing the few things she'd taken with her during their separation, allowing herself, cautiously, to imagine a version of her life restored to what it had been before that terrible birthday. Then she walked into the house one afternoon and found Chloe standing in the kitchen. Danielle stopped in the doorway, confusion curdling quickly into dread. "What are you doing here?" Chloe looked at her with an expression that wasn't triumphant so much as tired, as though she too had grown weary of whatever role she'd been assigned in Derek's life. "He never stopped sleeping with me," she said flatly. "I thought you should know before you signed anything." The words hit Danielle like a physical blow, worse somehow than the humiliation of the restaurant, because this time there was no audience to witness it, no one to soften the moment with sympathy. Just the quiet kitchen, where she'd cooked thousands of meals for a man who had never stopped lying to her. Derek arrived home minutes later to find both women standing in his kitchen, and he did what he always did best. He lied with total conviction. He told Danielle that Chloe was bitter, unstable, desperate to sabotage his second chance at happiness. He was so calm, so practiced in his denial, that Danielle found herself questioning what she just heard with her own ears, doubting the woman standing right in front of her, instead of the man who had spent over 2 decades teaching her that his version of reality was the only one that mattered. She stayed. Despite everything, despite Chloe's words hanging in the air like an unresolved verdict, Danielle stayed in that house that night, telling herself Derek's explanation made sense, telling herself she wanted to believe him because believing him was easier than accepting she'd made the same mistake twice. It would take Min Jae's next discovery to finally break through the fog Derek had spent 23 years building around her. Because while Danielle was busy convincing herself to trust a man who had never once earned it, Min Jae's security team had already uncovered something that would change everything. Min Jae hadn't stopped watching, even after Danielle walked out of his office and back into her old life. He told himself it was simple due diligence, the same instinct that had made him successful in every other area of his life, an unwillingness to leave loose threads unexamined. He didn't believe that explanation completely, not even to himself, but it was enough to justify what happened next. He assigned 2 of his most trusted people to look into Derek's finances. What they found took less than a week to compile, and it was worse than anyone expected. Bank transfers moved through accounts Danielle had never known existed. Messages between Derek and a lawyer discussing the fastest legal path to accessing an inheritance that technically belonged to her, one she had never touched, barely understood, tied up for years in paperwork she'd never had the energy to sort through. Documents already drafted, waiting only for Danielle's signature to transfer control of assets she didn't even know she possessed. It was all there, meticulous, deliberate, damning. Min Jae sat with the folder in front of him for a long time before deciding what to do with it. He could have used it. A man with his resources could have destroyed Derek quietly, efficiently, without Danielle ever needing to know the details of how it happened. It would have been simple. It would have been satisfying. Instead, he called her. Danielle arrived at his office wary, uncertain why he'd summoned her after weeks of careful distance, bracing herself for a conversation she didn't yet understand she needed. Min Jae didn't waste time with preamble. He slid the folder across the desk toward her, the same way he'd slid the property assignment weeks earlier, except this time his expression carried none of the professional detachment from before. "You deserve to know the truth," he said. Danielle opened the folder with trembling hands, and the truth unfolded in front of her 1 page at a time. The transfers, the messages, the lawyer's carefully worded strategy for accessing her mother's estate before Danielle even understood what she stood to lose. Every piece of it confirmed what Chloe had tried to tell her weeks earlier in that kitchen, what some quiet, exhausted part of Danielle had already suspected and refused to let herself believe. She looked up at Min-jae, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you stop him? It would have been so easy for him to. He had the resources, the leverage, the reach, to end Derek's scheme before it ever reached this point, to have simply handled the situation the way he handled everything else in his life, quietly and without consequence to anyone he cared about. Danielle almost expected him to say as much, to explain some tactical delay, some strategic reason for waiting. Instead, Min-jae said something that would stay with her far longer than anything Derek had ever told her. Because if I save you from every bad decision, he said, you'll never learn that you can save yourself. The words settled into her slowly, and something in her chest cracked open in a way that had nothing to do with grief. For 23 years, she had been protected, managed, controlled, told what to wear, what to want, what to believe about her own worth. Even now, even in this act of quiet kindness, Min-jae was refusing to simply rescue her. He was handing her the truth and trusting her to decide, for the first time in longer than she could remember, what she wanted to do with it. Danielle left his office that evening with the folder clutched against her chest, and she didn't go home. She sat alone in her car outside his building for nearly an hour, reading through every document twice, feeling something shift inside her that felt less like heartbreak and more like clarity. For the first time since that humiliating night in the restaurant, Danielle wasn't crying. She was furious. Not at Chloe, not even entirely at herself for believing Derek's lies a second time, but at the 23 years of small cruelties that had trained her to accept so little, that had convinced her love required constant sacrifice and endless forgiveness for a man who had never once extended her the same grace. She drove home that night with a plan forming, cold and precise, unlike anything she'd allowed herself to feel in years. The next morning, she confronted Derek. This time, she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She walked into the kitchen where he was calmly drinking his coffee, completely unaware that his carefully constructed lies had already unraveled, and set a folder of divorce papers on the table in front of him. Derek looked up at her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, uncertainty, maybe even the beginning of fear, quickly replaced by the same arrogance that had carried him through their entire marriage. "You think some Korean boy is going to marry you?" He sneered, reaching for the coffee mug, as though the conversation was already beneath him. Danielle looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was steady in a way it hadn't been in over 2 decades. "No," she said simply. A pause, long enough that Derek's smugness began to falter slightly. "I'm divorcing you," she continued, "because I'm tired of being married to someone who doesn't love me." Derek's expression shifted rapidly through several stages: disbelief, anger, and finally something closer to desperation, as he realized she wasn't performing this confrontation for his benefit, wasn't waiting for him to talk her out of it the way he always had before. He threatened her, listing everything she stood to lose, reminding her of every insecurity he'd spent years cultivating. Danielle didn't move. He shifted tactics, softening his voice, begging her to reconsider, promising this time would be different. She didn't move. Finally, cornered and furious, he reached for the only weapon he had left, the one that had always worked before. "You're 45 years old, Danielle. Nobody else is going to want you." Danielle looked at him, and instead of the wound he expected to reopen, something entirely unexpected crossed her face. She smiled. "I'm 45, she said quietly. Then, with a certainty that seemed to surprise even herself, she added, "And somehow, that's the first thing about myself I've ever been proud of." Derek stood there for a long moment, the coffee mug still in his hand, searching her face for some crack he could exploit, some familiar opening he'd relied on for over 2 decades. He didn't find one. Whatever version of Danielle he'd built his entire marriage around, the version who apologized for taking up space, who negotiated her own worth down to nothing just to keep the peace, that version wasn't standing in the kitchen with him anymore. "You'll regret this," he said finally, his voice losing the confident edge it had carried moments earlier. You have no idea what you're walking away from. I know exactly what I'm walking away from, Danielle replied. 23 years of it. She gathered her coat from the chair where she'd left it, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she walked out of that house without waiting for his permission, without checking his expression to gauge whether she'd upset him, without any of the small automatic calculations that had governed marriage since the beginning. The door closed behind her with a quiet, unremarkable click, nothing like the dramatic slam the moment probably deserved, and somehow that made it more final than anything else could have. Danielle expected to feel triumphant walking out of that house for the final time. Divorce papers signed, the weight of 23 years finally set down. What she felt instead was hollow, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She drove straight to Min Jae's office without calling ahead, some part of her assuming, foolishly, that he would simply be waiting for her the way he always seemed to be, that the story would resolve itself the moment she walked through his door. He was there, but nothing about the moment played out the way she expected. "I care about you," Min Jae told her, standing near the window of his office, with his hands in his pockets, his expression carrying none of the warmth she'd anticipated. Danielle felt something twist in her chest. "Then why won't you forgive me?" "Because forgiveness isn't the same as pretending nothing happened," he said, his voice steady, without cruelty, but without softening either. "You went back to him, Danielle. After everything, I watched you choose him over yourself, and I understand why, but understanding isn't the same as it not mattering." The words stung more than Derek's cruelty ever had, precisely because there was no malice behind them, only honesty. Danielle stood there, absorbing the reality that Min Jae wasn't going to simply erase the last several weeks because she'd finally come to her senses. He wasn't interested in rescuing her from the consequences of her own choices, and slowly, painfully, she began to understand that this wasn't rejection. It was respect. "I don't want the woman who is afraid to be alone," Min Jae continued, watching her carefully. "I want the woman who chooses me because she doesn't need me." Danielle felt tears rise, not from heartbreak this time, but from something closer to recognition. 23 years of marriage had taught her that love meant earning your place through sacrifice, through smallness, through constant proof of your own worth. Derek had built a marriage on her fear of being insufficient. Min Jae was offering something entirely different, something that terrified her precisely because it required her to become whole on her own before she could stand beside anyone else. She left his office that day without any promises exchanged, without any dramatic declaration to close the distance between them. For the first time in her adult life, Danielle walked away from a man not because she'd been discarded, but because she understood, finally, that she needed to. The months that followed were unlike anything Danielle had experienced in over 2 decades. She used what remained of her savings, along with the inheritance Derek had never managed to touch thanks to Min Jae's early warning, to start the consulting business she'd once folded into a drawer and forgotten. It was slow at first, uncertain. Every decision made without anyone's approval but her own, for the first time in her adult life. She made mistakes. She learned from them, without anyone standing over her shoulder telling her she should have known better. Slowly, her client list grew. Word spread about the woman who had turned around one of Min Jae's failing properties, and other businesses began seeking her out, drawn to the same sharp, patient competence that had impressed him months earlier. Within the year, Danielle was running a company entirely her own, built from nothing but her own judgment and the quiet confidence she'd spent decades burying. She started dressing for herself again, not out of obligation or performance, but because she liked the way certain colors made her feel, because a well-tailored blazer made her stand a little taller in rooms full of people who didn't yet know what she was capable of. She traveled for the first time in years, alone at first, then eventually with the handful of friends she'd reconnected with. After years of isolation, Derek had quietly engineered without her ever noticing. She laughed more, genuinely, easily, in a way that no longer required anyone's permission. There were harder days too, days the story didn't advertise on the surface, days when Danielle sat in her new office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at a spreadsheet she'd already memorized, wondering whether she'd made a catastrophic mistake walking away from the only life she'd ever known. 23 years didn't unwind themselves neatly. There were nights she reached for her phone to call Derek out of pure habit before catching herself, startled by how deeply certain patterns had rooted themselves into her nervous system. She learned, slowly, that healing wasn't a straight line. It looped back on itself. It ambushed her in grocery stores when she saw a couple picking out anniversary flowers, in the quiet hours after midnight when the house felt too large for one person. She found a therapist eventually, a recommendation from her sister, and spent months unpacking exactly how deeply Derek's small cruelties had rewired her sense of self-worth. It wasn't glamorous work. There were sessions where she cried until she couldn't speak, sessions where she left angrier than when she arrived, furious at the years she couldn't get back. But slowly, piece by piece, she began separating the woman Derek had convinced her she was from the woman she'd actually become, underneath all that conditioning. Her sister became her closest ally during that stretch, showing up unannounced with takeout on the nights Danielle couldn't muster the energy to cook for herself, sitting with her through the silences that used to belong to Derek. Old friendships she'd let wither during her marriage slowly rekindled, tentative at first, then warmer, as though the women in her life had simply been waiting for her to come back to them. Min-jae remained a quiet presence throughout that year, though he never pushed, never pressured her to define what existed between them before she was ready. He would appear at industry events where her new clients gathered, always cordial, always respectful of the distance she'd needed to keep between them. Occasionally they had dinner, no longer disguised as business meetings, conversations that lingered long after the plates had been cleared. He never asked her where they stood. He simply stayed, patient in a way that Danielle slowly came to understand was its own kind of devotion. By the time her 46th birthday approached, Danielle barely recognized the woman she'd been the year before, the one who had stood beside an untouched cake, while her husband humiliated her in front of everyone she loved. She had built something entirely her own. She had learned, finally, that her worth had never depended on anyone else's willingness to see it. Min-jae called her a week before her birthday, his voice carrying a rare note of something close to nervousness she'd never heard from him before. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "For your birthday." Danielle agreed without hesitation, unaware of exactly where he intended to bring her, unaware of how deliberately he'd chosen the location, unaware that the same restaurant where her old life had ended in humiliation was about to become the setting for something else entirely. The night of her 46th birthday arrived with a kind of quiet symmetry Danielle hadn't fully processed until the car pulled up outside the restaurant and she recognized the entrance immediately. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected this, hadn't thought to ask where they were going, and now, standing on the sidewalk in a deep emerald dress that fit her like it had been made for exactly this moment, she felt the old panic rise briefly before something steadier settled in its place. "I wanted you to see something," Min-jae said, his hand finding hers as they walked toward the entrance. The last time Danielle had stood in this doorway, she had been humiliated in front of everyone she loved, left alone beside a cake nobody touched. Walking through it now felt like stepping into a memory that no longer had power over her, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that her hands weren't shaking at all. Inside, the room had been transformed. The same table where Derek had once delivered the cruelest words of her life now sat at the center of a space entirely reimagined, candles glowing warm against the walls, flowers she recognized from her own favorite garden arrangements, every detail deliberately, carefully chosen. Danielle stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the deliberateness of it, by the realization that Min-jae had spent weeks planning to reclaim this exact space for something entirely different than what it had once represented. He led her to the table, and, once she was seated, he didn't sit across from her the way she expected. Instead, he lowered himself onto one knee beside her chair, and the entire room, which Danielle only now realized was filled with familiar faces, her sister, her closest friends, the small handful of people who had watched her survive the worst night of her life in this exact room, went completely silent. Danielle's hand flew to her mouth. "Last year," Min-jae said, his voice steady despite the moment, "a man told you that nobody would choose you at 45. Danielle felt tears rising immediately. her carefully composed exterior cracking in an instant. "I don't want to choose you because you're younger than him," Min-jae continued. "I don't want to choose you because you're richer than him." He paused, and something in his expression softened into a vulnerability Danielle had rarely seen from him. "I choose you because when everyone else looked at what you had become, I saw who you had always been." He opened the small box in his hand, and the ring inside caught the candlelight. "Danielle Carter," he said, "will you marry me?" The room held its breath along with her. Danielle looked at him, at the man who had never once tried to rescue her from her own choices, who had waited patiently through an entire year of her becoming someone she barely recognized, who had brought her back to the exact place her old life ended to offer her something entirely new. A long pause stretched between them, long enough that Danielle watched a flicker of uncertainty cross Min-jae's face for the first time since she'd known him. "I need time," she said quietly. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to deflate along with him. Min-jae's expression shifted, something composed and steady settling back over his features as he began to rise from the floor. "Take all the time you need," he said, and there was no bitterness in it, only the same patient respect he'd shown her from the very beginning. But as he started to stand, Danielle's hand shot out and caught his. "Actually," she said, something breaking open in her voice, "I think I've wasted enough time." She rose from her chair before he could fully process what she'd said, closed the distance between them, and kissed him in front of everyone in that room, in the exact space where a different man had once told her she was no longer worth wanting. The room erupted. Her sister was crying. Someone in the back began recording on their phone, the moment already spreading before the night was even over. Min-jae pulled back just far enough to look at her, disbelief and relief tangled together on his face, and Danielle laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that felt nothing like the nervous laugh she'd offered Derek on this same floor a year earlier. But as the celebration continued around them, as champagne was poured and her sister pulled her into a fierce embrace, Danielle's phone buzzed once in her clutch. A message from an unknown number, sent at the exact moment Min-jae had gotten down on one knee, as though someone in that room had been watching the entire proposal unfold in real time. The message contained only a single photograph. Derek, standing outside the restaurant windows in the dark, watching everything happen through the glass, his expression unreadable. Beneath the photo, 3 words. "This isn't over." Danielle stared at the screen, the warmth of the last few minutes suddenly replaced by something cold settling low in her stomach. Min-jae noticed the shift in her expression immediately, his hand tightening gently around hers. "What is it?" he asked. Danielle looked up at him, then back toward the windows, but whoever had been standing outside was already gone. She didn't answer him, not yet, because somewhere outside that restaurant, Derek was still watching, still waiting, and Danielle understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever came next was only beginning. She slipped the phone back into her clutch and forced a smile back onto her face, not wanting to steal this moment from the people who had shown up to celebrate her, from Min-jae, who deserved at least one night that belonged entirely to them. But underneath the laughter, underneath the champagne being poured into glasses around her, a cold thread of unease had already settled into her chest and refused to loosen. She excused herself a few minutes later, telling her sister she needed air, the same words she'd used to escape this exact room a year earlier, except this time, she wasn't running from humiliation. She was checking to see if he was still out there. The street outside was empty, no black car waiting across from the entrance, no figure lingering in the shadows the way there had been the night everything started. But Danielle had learned enough about Derek over 23 years of marriage to know that his absence didn't mean safety. It meant patience. It meant he was already 3 steps ahead, working some plan she wouldn't see coming until it was already unfolding around her. She stood there for a long moment, the cold air sharp against her bare arms, the same arms Derek had once told her were too big to show off, the same arms Min-jae had told her belonged to a man too blind to see what he had. She thought about how far she'd come in a single year, and how quickly one photograph, one message, could threaten to unravel it. When she walked back inside, Min-jae was waiting near the entrance, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see the concern he was trying not to show. He didn't press her. He simply took her hand and asked if she wanted to stay or if she'd rather go somewhere quieter to talk. "Stay," she told him. "Tonight is still mine." But even as she said it, even as she let him lead her back to the celebration, back to her sister's tearful embrace, and the champagne and the ring now sitting on her finger, some part of Danielle was already bracing for whatever Derek had planned next. 23 years had taught her one thing above all else. He never made a threat he didn't intend to follow through on. Whatever Derek was planning, one thing was certain. He had underestimated her once already, and he was about to learn exactly how far the woman he'd humiliated on this same floor was willing to go to protect what she'd finally built for herself. If you want to know what Derek has planned and what happens the moment Danielle walks out of that restaurant, comment part 2 down below and let me know you want more. Make sure you've subscribed to Stories from Seoul so you don't miss it when it drops. Drop a like if you made it this far, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight.